Now, Van Til, this is a footnote that Frame has, Van Til suggests that the contradiction appears only at first sight. Elsewhere, he seems to argue that it is irresolvable by any created intellect. That is, there are paradoxes in the Bible that we can't possibly untangle. Van Til sometimes uses deduction, sometimes forbids it, but never explains when one rather than the other is the case. And of course, that's just the trouble with Van Til, isn't it? Omnipotence is not paradoxical, for nothing in Scripture contradicts it. God's sovereignty and man's responsibility are paradoxical, and to remove that contradiction would be to compromise either God's sovereignty or man's responsibility. Let me read this over again. I'll tell you where the quotation begins. I have summarized a little bit before the quotation begins. The summary is like this. Omnipotence is not paradoxical, for nothing in Scripture contradicts it. Although on another page he says everything in Scripture is paradoxical. Omnipotence is not paradoxical, for nothing in Scripture contradicts it. God's sovereignty and man's responsibility are paradoxical. Quote, to remove that contradiction would be to compromise either God's sovereignty or man's responsibility. End of quote. But if omnipotence, these are my words, if omnipotence is not paradoxical, as Frame said above, quote, what are we to make of his statement that all teaching of Scripture is apparently contradictory? Now that's Frame's statement about Van Til. I would suppose that Van Til might say this, but at any rate, that's the way Frame understands Van Til. No, in fact, this is a quotation from Van Til. There's a double quotation here. These two things mean Frame's statement. What are we to make of his statement that all teaching of Scripture is apparently contradictory? Question mark. Now, Van Til said that omnipotence is not self-contradictory, but creation and responsibility are contradictory. And also he said all teaching of Scripture is apparently contradictory, which would, of course, include the idea of omnipotence. Our concepts are limiting concepts. Now here Van Til misuses language, for Kant means something quite different. The word limiting concept arose with Kant and it has a certain meaning. Van Til takes the phrase but uses it in a different sense, and it's hard to know what he means. It's something like this. Limiting concept means merely that there are some things we do not know about a tree, for example. It merely means that our knowledge is not exhaustive. Well, that's not what anybody in philosophy meant by a limiting concept. And furthermore, here Van Til thinks of things, like a tree, as being an object of knowledge. His confusion vanishes if we take propositions to be the objects of knowledge. If in interpreting Scripture, putting the two verses together produces an apparent contradiction, then so be it. End of quote. You're doing some exegesis, and you come up against an apparent contradiction. Well, all right, let it stand. Don't examine your interpretation to see what mistake you've made. Just let it stand. Quote, the doctrine of justification by faith, when fully explained in its relation to the rest of scriptural truth, is just as paradoxical as divine sovereignty. Even the omnipotence of God, then, shares with other doctrines a paradoxical element. And of course, a few pages before he said it wasn't paradoxical. And then we have the final statement, well, near the final. All teaching of Scripture is apparently contradictory. All teaching of Scripture, that's verbatim, all teaching of Scripture is apparently contradictory. I might say that the statement David was a king of Israel is not apparently contradictory to me. Now, a sort of a conclusion, quote, logic has made only small steps in this task, describing the conditions of intelligibility for a few key terms like all, if then, and so on, only in certain narrowly defined contexts. For example, man has, in one sense, and has not, in another, lost the image of God as the result of the fall. Since the senses are not clearly specifiable, we have an apparent contradiction. End of quote. Similar to what was said before. And even my remark is, even if the senses were not specifiable, there would not be an apparent contradiction anyway. And further, they are specifiable. And then there's a little paragraph that winds it up nicely, and that's the end.